All right, so welcome everybody. Today we are going to be talking about newsletters. So, just as a brief introduction, if you're not familiar with me, most of you are, but just in case we have this covered, I'm Zach Ralston with ASC Tech Web Services. I'm the training and support specialist, and I'm also going to be the presenter today for this training. So here is a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to be talking about the newsletter feature in Drupal. And some of you already have some training with this. Some of you belong to departments that already have a newsletter, but we're kind of going to go over the basics and the process to setting up a newsletter, in addition to some very important questions that you should be asking yourself before you fire off a newsletter for your website. We're also going to talk a little bit about circulation, and I'm going to kind of go through a few example websites for you that are pretty great models for newsletters. So as I said, Drupal newsletters are a content type on the ASC standard sites, which is everything Drupal 9. And we're eventually going to go to Drupal 10, and it's still going to be here, by the way. But essentially, they're a content type that lets you manage and edit newsletter issues and articles on your website. And they're a great tool for outreach and keeping your audience engaged with what's going on with your office, your center, your department. And we also have a lot of different uses for doing that for a newsletter, right? So for example, I have to the right here, this is from the School of Communications. And as you can see to the right, we have letters from the director. We have information about undergrad programs, graduate programs, opportunities, things like that, donor spotlights, teaching spotlights, alumni spotlights, things like that. But it's also great for outreach, publishing research that is newsworthy, interviews, which is something that happens quite a bit with some departments. They'll typically interview either a member of faculty or a student doing something that's really, really great and eye-catching. And these kind of things kind of help you keep connected to a desired audience. And this audience can be anywhere from potential donors or undergraduate students or potential students. This is all part of outreach at the end of the day. So right before you go and get excited and creating a newsletter, there's some steps that you can follow that really help you get the most out of this and really help you kind of determine the level of impact that a newsletter is going to have for your website, right? And one of the very first things that you probably should be considering about when you're doing a newsletter is identifying who the audience is. And there's some questions that are involved in that process as well, determining what they're interested in and kind of figuring out what kind of content do you want to connect with them? What is going to appeal to this audience? You kind of want to narrow it down as well, right? We all typically want to say, we want the general public. We want everyone. We want as many eyes as possible, right? But when you're thinking about your audience, you do have to narrow it down, because if you're trying to take a too broad approach, you try to appeal to everybody, you end up really appealing to nobody. Knowing who your audience is kind of like the first step. And one of the great ways to kind of learn about that is through your analytics reports, which you can contact us at any time you want to get access to that and help answer that question. And then when you're thinking about, your newsletter, when you have all this information with you, this helps you really start to plan the kind of content you want. Additionally, too, besides just identifying your audience, you also want to figure out, well, what's the purpose and what are the goals for the newsletter? How do the goals help you fulfill the purpose of this newsletter, right? And newsletters don't have to have just one single purpose. As we just saw with the School of Communications one, it's doing a lot of different things. It's showing off information. It's highlighting donors. It's showing off what students are doing. It has interviews of what's going on. It's talking about things that the programs that they're offering. So in addition to that, making sure you have like the purpose of your newsletter figured out well ahead of time This also kind of helps you with the content planning phase, right? And additionally, too, and we talked about this in a previous training presentation with SEO and content, was determining your intent and your visitor's intent, right? Or in this case, we can go with the terminology of department intent versus user intent. So you have what you want to do, you know your audience, you know what you want to give your audience, but you also kind of have to be able to know what's the purpose that a random visitor is trying to accomplish. Because visitors tend to be very task focused, right? They're very task oriented. They want to find some information, get what they want as efficiently as possible. So usually one of the things that you also have to consider when you're at this purpose and goals portion of newsletter planning is also knowing what your audience wants from you, right? This kind of goes back to just knowing who the audience is. So this is just kind of rehashing some of the things I've already said. Goals are kind of, they're very important. They're not kind of important, they're very important when it comes to thinking about the purpose of your newsletter, right? Or if it's even going to be worth the time that goes into investing in regular content for a newsletter. So it's helpful to think of goals as check marks or checkpoints towards, fulfilling the purpose of this, right? And usually goal planning can be very context dependent, right? So for example, if you're using your newsletter primarily for undergraduate recruitment and you start out this newsletter, are you starting to see an uptick in applications for your programs or anything like that? So usually having like some kind of goal lets you evaluate how well this is going to work in the future. It gives you a metric to measure performance, essentially, of your newsletter, in addition to relying on your analytics as well. And if you don't really know what those are, I would strongly recommend that you kind of come up with those goals. What are those metrics going to be, for example, for your department or your team? And then when you have those things figured out, right? You know your audience, you have the purpose of your newsletter figured out, and you have the goals like built and ready to use as a metric. Then it's kind of when we get to the content planning stage, right? And this is where we also ask ourselves, what kind of content do you want to publish? Does the content that you want to publish align with the purpose and goals of your newsletter? And the content can be pretty, these are just a few examples listed here. It's not limited to just what I have available here. But for example, some of the stuff I've listed here includes alumni success stories, student achievements, interviews with faculty about specific subjects that they're experts in, research news stories, department updates, things like that. So that's not a whole comprehensive list of what can be content. You can be pretty creative, actually, about what content can be for a newsletter. You just want to make sure that you're sticking to your overall purpose and your goals, just so they're all kind of coherent and you're able to measure how that stuff is performing as you're publishing this content. So this is where we start to get into the actual setup process. How do you go about this? Newsletters operate very differently from other types of content on Drupal. So the way that we have this built is that you actually have to have somebody with administrator privileges to create a newsletter landing page for your newsletter, right? So your very first step would be to contact our team, ASC Tech Web Services. So the most efficient way that I would strongly recommend doing that to reach out to us is to create a ticket. This way, we're able to make sure we're getting back to you. It's not getting lost in the inbox of our emails. And it also kind of makes sure that we're providing you consistent quality of service. So when you do reach out, you create your ticket, or you do decide to email us. Email is fine too. We just strongly encourage that you create tickets just because it's the safest way that we get back to you, right? So once we get all that down, this is where we start to create the newsletter landing page. So it would most likely be me. I'm their point of contact person to get this started. And I kind of walk you through not only the process of creating this, but I'm also going to be available to answer any questions you have. If you want to talk about goals or content planning, this is a perfect opportunity to kind of get that figured out. So this isn't just me creating the landing page for you. And sometimes it actually is, because I've had people who do have they know what they're going for. They know who their audience is. They're ready to go, right? And sometimes that's perfectly fine. But this is just to kind of reinforce this as an opportunity for me to kind of work with you to plan some of that stuff, to get those questions answered that you might have, not just to kind of push the big button that says, here's your landing page, have fun, right? So just to kind of give you a general overview of the structure of a newsletter, the newsletter landing page is where everything newsletter related is on your website, right? Whenever someone accesses your newsletter, this is going to be essentially the home page specifically for that. And as you can see below, like this big banner here, we have individual issues, right? And depending on what your department has planned, you might publish issues on like a biweekly basis. You may do it by semester. It might be biannual. The time frame can be completely dependent on all kinds of factors: your content, your audience, your team, things like that. So for example, this is the biannual newsletter for the Department of Mathematics. Here we can see that they do things typically by semester. So for example, their latest issue looks like it was from this summer of 2022. And the previous one was spring 2022. And it kind of keeps going back. They don't really seem, oh no, they actually do have a fall. They actually do have a fall issue. Okay. So they might not have the most consistent pattern. And sometimes that changes, and that's okay sometimes. But kind of keeping a consistent pattern of when you're creating newsletter issues is pretty important. So moving on to newsletter issues. Issues are where individual articles that users are going to read live. So this is just a way of organizing all of your newsletter articles. It's kind of like a homepage within a homepage, if that makes sense. As you can see with the Department of Mathematics, this is their summer 2022 issue. So they actually have a lot more available on here. I just can't capture it all, unfortunately. They have like a welcome article from the Department of Mathematics. They have a COSI field trip. They have a new faculty member spotlight, things like that. And this is where essentially the main article is. This is a newsletter article. This is your individual piece that someone is writing. This is basically the main content of any newsletter. And as you can see here, this is a welcome message from the Department of Mathematics. And it's also introducing them, visitors, to the newsletter itself, not just to the department. So this is like a great example of outreach. This is kind of building a bridge to your audience. This is explaining what kind of content that's going to be hosted on the newsletter, things like that. Whereas everything else that we saw in this specific issue, summer 2022 for mathematics department, is essentially going to be like faculty spotlight, COSI field trip, research-based articles, things like that, right? And essentially, when we create articles, and we'll get into this in just a bit, we're going to see how we kind of connect everything in our menus. So another way that newsletters operate really differently than other kinds of content on Drupal is that there is a section called the newsletter outline. So instead of creating a menu link like you would do with other forms of content, right? You would create a newsletter outline instead. So for example, here, this is kind of just creating the landing page menu stuff. So this is something I would work with you the time that we decide to get this started, right? So as you can see to the far right here, newsletter outline, this is cut off here, but it's directly underneath the menu link button. And you can see here, there's an option to create a new newsletter, which is something that we would do if you don't have any pre-existing content already, because this is essentially going to be the parent item for all your other newsletter stuff. In this menu, this is where we start off first. So second, we kind of follow the same routine with the newsletter issues themselves. So for example, the parent item is the new newsletter that we just created here. And again, it's also handled in the newsletter outline menu. And we're going to see this pattern repeat with the newsletter article here. So this is where we start to actually connect all our pieces together, right? So the newsletter has the very creative name of newsletter here, of course. And the parent item that the articles are going to be under, that's going to be the issue here. So this issue that this article is going to live under is spring of 2021. So once we get all of that figured out, we get that all established, we have our newsletter up, everything's connected, everything's good to go, and you're ready to start publishing our content. Now, the next thing you're probably going to be wondering is, how are people going to find this and how am I going to share this? So we actually have a couple of options to do that here. So the more manual option, I guess you could call it that for lack of a better phrase, is using the option of making this shareable on social media. So the links that we have to the right here, we have Facebook, we have a Twitter, we have LinkedIn, and we have through email. These allow you to create shareable links on all these platforms. You would literally just click one of these buttons that it automatically produces a URL and an embed link essentially for all those social media platforms. And then depending on what you're using, you could directly post this to Facebook. You could directly post this to Twitter. If you're using some other platform like Hootsuite, for example, something that kind of helps you automate that, I'm pretty sure that these work with that as well. If you have any questions about this, you can reach out and we can kind of give you more definitive answers of what these specific links work with regards to other platforms like Hootsuite. And the second way to kind of get your circulation for your newsletter going is to kind of reach out to the ASC Comm team at ascom@osu.edu. They provide all kinds of guidance for everything marketing related, outreach related. They've helped us actually establish our newsletter, and they've been a great team. So the only thing that we would advise is to kind of give them at least 2 to 3 weeks lead time in advance to circulating your first issue, just because they get like a lot of requests. So we have a few examples that I mentioned right before I started recording that we would be going through here. We don't have to go through every single one of these, but I picked these just because I think these are some of the best examples I've seen of a newsletter, right? So first we have Department of Dance, we have the biannual newsletter, and we have the Department of Mathematics, which we've already seen quite a bit of that. We've already seen some of the School of Communication. So I think we're going to skip these two just for now. And we're going to stick with Department of Dance because I think they get really creative with what they have in stock. So this is Inform. This is the Department of Dance's newsletter, right? So it looks like they're publishing things also by semester. It's kind of like the most common way of doing it. Spring, winter, autumn 2021. Let's see what they have most recently. So we can see they have like a welcome message, faculty. They have a new faculty member, Associate Professor Abby Zibikowski, the Israel Institute visiting artists, all kinds of things like that. Raise initiative. And one thing I think they're doing spectacularly well is the fact that they're using like photos that they've taken themselves. So not relying on stock images. This lets you know that they're producing content that, they're pretty proud of. They want you to see, examples of what they do, what they're all about. And we're going to go check out this one. It's another welcome message. Revision faculty and guest artist concerts, performances, all kinds of stuff. MFA candidates plan spring projects. We can see what that one looks like, for example. And as you can see, it looks like it's a Zoom meeting here. So Master of Fine Arts and Dance at the Ohio State University. It's a 3-year program, recognized. Okay, and it goes right straight to it. There's a lot of content that they have here. So they're putting a lot of work into this. And I really, really love the way that, they include so much of what they're doing, not just in the articles themselves, but just the overall look, everything like that. I think it's great. So yeah, moving on. Last but not least, this is the resource section. I harp on this every single time, but this is just so these resources are available to you. So we have the Drupal standard sites Microsoft team. You're free to join that. This is kind of like a more efficient way of getting updates and reaching out to us if you have any questions. So the link to that is go.osu.edu/DSS. And there's also the Web Services Knowledge Base. So I mention this every single time as well, but I update this with recordings of these presentations. They're edited down for time's sake, so you're not going through like 30 minutes of content of just me talking through a PowerPoint. These kind of get straight to the point as well. But it's also a great resource for other things too, like writing for the web, how to use images of Drupal, and getting your analytics, getting new websites set up, all kinds of things. So we're always expanding on this, and I encourage you to check it out at u.osu/ASCweb.